Blackwater Ben by William Durbin. We're on chapter 5, A Trip to the Dentist. Good morning. Ben tapped on the rough plank wood door with a fist while he balanced Charlie's breakfast in the other hand. Doors open, Charlie called. Ben stepped inside. Charlie was bent over his wooden saw, vice with a file in his hand. Charlie was a thin fellow whose skin was so white and papery that you could see little veins underneath. Though his hair didn't have a trace of gray, his slumped shoulders made him look old. He had a scraggly brown beard, and like the pencil pusher, he wore wire-rimmed glasses. He looked through his glasses when he was sharpening a saw, but he peered over the top when he talked to people. Wendy claimed that the dentist hadn't had a bath for 25 years, but he didn't seem any dirtier than the other loggers. The yellow sleeves of his woolen underwear suggested that when his old suit wore out, he just put a new one on over the old one. Mm-hmm. The dentist's board shack was the only building in the camp other than a 4-hold outhouse that wasn't built out of logs. Only 12 feet by 12, it had a double skylight in the roof and was crowded with files, hammers, saw, gauges, and a rack of Tuttle and Champion crosscuts. Ben expected Charlie to complain about his breakfast being late, but he only waved toward the table and said, "Leave the grub there." Charlie had a funny accent, and he used strange words like barmy when he meant crazy and codswallop when he meant nonsense. Charlie kept filing on his saw as Ben pushed aside a set hammer to make room for the food tray on the workbench. Ben glanced at the wall. A few of the Jacks owned a copy of Police Gazette or Argosy magazine, but the shelves of Charlie's bunk held 3 rows of books. "Your library reminds me of Mrs. Wilson's," Charlie kept filing. "She's the widow lady that Pa and I live with. Miss Wilson's got at least a dozen books in her collection. One's like Pilgrim's Progress and Robinson Crusoe. And she owns 3 different Bibles, including the one that was written in German. When Charlie wouldn't talk, Ben picked up the previous evening's dishes and asked, "Do you need anything more?" "A little grub and a lot of misery whips." Charlie looked up at Ben. "Misery whips is what I call these crosscut saws. They're all I need to keep me busy." Just then, Ben noticed a row of photographs hanging beside the bookcase. "Who are the ladies?" he asked. "Years ago, I went through what I call my romantic period. I fell in and out of love 4 times in 2 years." Charlie gave a short laugh. "That face looks familiar." Ben studied the last picture. "You really blither on, don't you?" Charlie said, setting down his file and turning his attention to his food. "Blither? That means you talk too much." Ben figured that was a hint for him to go. As he left, he wondered what could have caused Charlie to revolt against baths. Lots of the Jacks didn't bother to wash during the winter season, but Ben had never heard of a fellow skipping out on a spring cleaning. Outside, a light snow was falling, and the air smelled of pine needles. The snowflakes caught flecks of sunlight and sparkled as they floated onto the tar paper roofs of the camp. The fresh snow would be welcomed by the skid men and the teamsters who dragged the logs to the roadsides. As soon as Ben opened the door, Pa said, "About time, we gotta get our crusts rolled out, or we'll never have these pies baked by lunchtime." Ben grabbed a rolling pin. For lunch, they prepared 7 pies, 6 loaves of bread, a pot full of beans, and a kettle of stew. They also brewed fresh swamp water and warmed more logging berries. While Pa worked on the pie crusts, Ben asked, "Why don't you ever talk about Mother?" Pa stopped his rolling pin, but kept his eyes down. "Don't you miss her?" Ben said. Pa's hands tightened on the rolling pin, but he didn't look up. "Of course I do," he said. "A day don't go by without me thinking of her." "How did she die?" "I've told you all that before. She took sick." "Was it sudden?" "What's the difference?" Pa's voice hardened. "No amount of jawing can bring her back. You just tend to your work." "I'm sorry, Pa," Ben said, "but I can't help but wondering." Pa checked his watch. "After all this gabbing, we're going to have to give her the tar paper to get this lunch done on time." Ben smiled. "Give her tar paper" was Pa's favorite expression. A few minutes later, Ben was sliding the first of the pie crusts into the oven. He stopped and made a face. "Did you burn yourself?" Pa asked. "I was just figuring," Ben replied, struggling with the cliffering in his head. "How many pies we'll have to make when all 80 men get here?" 30 should be close," Pa said. "And think of all the stew and the logging berries and beans that many fellows will eat," Ben said. "Don't forget the hundreds of cookies and rolls and donuts," Pa said. Ben barely had time to sleep as it was. What would happen when this workload increased it 4-fold? It's almost past noon, Pa said, hitching up the swindiggle. You want me to drive the lunch sleigh? With Skip gone, somebody has to haul this food to the cut. But I've never done it before. Do you know which end of the horse to point down the trail? Of course. Then go see the barn boss and harness up old Dan.